The monarchy of Britain has existed for centuries and has been part of some of the most incredible events in its nation's history. Along the way, some of the monarchs in power rose above the rest and distinguished themselves as the greatest monarchs to ever control the crown. Join me as I take a look at the top 10 greatest kings and queens of England. We begin our look at England's greatest kings and queens with a couple honorable mentions, beginning with King George V. George V, son of the oftentimes scandalized King Edward VII, would end up becoming almost the antithesis of his father socially. Being a conservative, frugal, and morally upright monarch, he ruled Britain at a time when the British Empire was arguably at its peak from a pure landholding standpoint. He of course was the king when the Great War, also known as World War I, broke out, and he would play his role as a wartime monarch dutifully and honorably. With the incredible political shifts that began to come about in the early 20th century, George was able to adeptly and strategically maintain his position as king when other monarchs around the world were being exiled, deposed, and killed. Nonetheless, by the time that George had come to the throne as a constitutional king, the institution of the monarchy as a whole exerted far less control than kings and queens of times past. Our next honorable mention is King George VI, or as he was originally known, Albert. Being the second son of the aforementioned King George V, George VI would come to the throne in an incredibly odd and unfortunate way. His elder brother, King Edward VIII, having been the heir since his birth, grew to disdain his position as heir apparent, which caused him to abdicate his position as king in order to follow his private passions. This threw his younger brother Albert unexpectedly into the limelight, bringing him to the throne as King George VI in an extremely unorthodox way. Despite George's reservations, he dutifully took on the oftentimes burdensome role as king with vigor, despite feeling helplessly unqualified and struggling with a debilitating stammer. George, unfortunately, soon encountered some of the same issues his father faced, as he too would become a wartime monarch during one of the deadliest conflicts to ever burden humanity, World War II. When Adolf Hitler and the Nazis began their conquest of Europe, George led his people valiantly and steadfastly through a very dark and dangerous time as the German war machine came knocking on Britain's door following their successful conquest of France. George, along with his powerful governmental allies, including most notably Winston Churchill, held the line against German aggression and stood unwaveringly alongside his people as they were devastated by the German Blitz. Nevertheless, despite being a bulwark against British defeat, George VI, like his father, was a constitutional monarch and thus held far less tangible power when compared to monarchs of centuries past. Coming in at number 10, we have Edward IV. Edward, son of Richard, Duke of York, grew up during tumultuous times when his father was jockeying for position during the chaotic reign of King Henry VI. With his father ultimately pushing the Yorkist claim to the throne, the conflict known today as the Wars of the Roses began to ravage England, with Edward being exposed early on to military training and campaign. This military experience in his youth would end up paying off in the long term after Edward took up his father's claim to the throne upon his father's death in 1460. Edward, fighting against many a capable Lancastrian army or commander, was successful in key battles, such as that of Mortimer's Cross, Northampton, Barnet, Tewkesbury, and most notably Towton, the bloodiest battle fought on English soil. These key victories allowed Edward to take control of the English crown and to rule uncontested for a time. Although Edward has often been discounted today and is remembered by some for his short exile, possible bigamy, scandalous marriage, and adulterous relationships, this does not deny the fact that he was a dominant military leader who bravely led his troops in battle during some of the most interesting and compelling events in England's history. This in turn has made him one of the most notable and successful warrior kings of England. At number 9, we have Henry V. Henry was known prior to his accession for less than favorable reasons. He was a difficult prince for his father Henry IV, engaging in questionable activities and pushing for ever more control and authority politically as his father aged. But upon his accession, Henry transformed himself into an exemplary monarch, committing himself to proper kingship and administration, which benefited him and England as a whole. Henry, having already established himself as a more than capable military commander in his youth, battling against the Welsh and rebellious northern barons, solidified his position in English history when he took advantage of the fracture lines that were presenting themselves in war-torn France. After winning a glorious victory at the Battle of Agincourt, Henry was able to insert himself into the French line of succession and exert English control in France, a feat which had not been done since the time of his great-grandfather, Edward III. Henry unfortunately died prematurely at the age of 35 in 1422 at the peak of his reign, thus preventing him from holding a higher position on this list of greatest English monarchs. In at number 8 we have William I, also known as William the Conqueror. William grew up in a harsh and difficult time as the bastard son of the Norman Lord Robert I. With his father dying young, William was thrust into the harsh world of medieval politics at a very young age, which molded him into an aggressive and brutal military leader. As he aged, he was able to successfully consolidate his power in Normandy, which put him in a position to engage in an event that would change the course of history, the Norman conquest of England. Pushing his claims to the English throne, William was able to land successfully at Pevensey Bay on the English coast in 1066, before decisively defeating the Anglo-Saxon ruler of England, Harold Godwinson, at the Battle of Hastings to secure England as part of his dominions. Although he is considered by some to be a particularly brutal ruler, the Herring of the North being cited by many a critic, this does not take away from the fact that his successful conquest of England had an immense effect on England's language, culture, and military capability, which over time would lead to England rising as a dominant world power. William was a product of his times and another warrior king, and thus remains on this list of greatest English monarchs. Coming in at number 7 we have Henry IV. Undoubtedly to be one of the more contentious and underrated persons on this list, Henry has often been remembered for the difficult reign he had after coming to the throne, being forced to deal with the difficult parliament and constant rebellions. But when the context of Henry's entire life is viewed in conjunction with his kingship, a clearer picture can be formed as to his incredible character and motivations. Henry was often a staunch opponent of his first cousin, the tyrannical King Richard II. Richard, whose pedigree was tainted by treasonous ancestors, was contrasted by his knightly cousin Henry, who came from a much cleaner bloodline, being the grandson of not only Edward III, but also of the famous Henry of Grosmont, the Duke of Lancaster and hero of the 100 Years' War. This brought forth great resentment between the two royal cousins, who were said to have been at odds with each other even in their youth. Henry, having narrowly escaped death in the Tower of London during the Peasants' Revolt, grew into an honorable and respected knight, becoming an incredible jouster in his youth and in time a respected warrior, going on crusade in Lithuania in 1390. Henry began standing up to his first cousin Richard II's tyranny early on, being a member of the so-called Lords Appellant, a group whose purpose was to halt Richard II's tyranny and usage of detestable favorites, which temporarily checked his power. Henry was instrumental in this group's success and was praised for his actions at the Battle of Radcot Bridge, which forced Richard into submission and his favorite into exile. Although Richard would bide his time, reconsolidate his power, unfairly exile Henry in 1398, and attempt to steal his inheritance, Henry would ultimately succeed in overcoming Richard's aggressive political maneuvers, coming back from exile on the continent to depose Richard and become king himself in 1399. After having Richard killed at Pontefract Castle, Henry was plagued by a difficult parliamentary commons and faced almost endless rebellion as rebellious northern barons and the Welsh revolted against his rule. But he never lost his crown. He was always successful in putting down the rebellions that arose, and was also able to keep his aggressive son at the time, the future Henry V, in check all the way up to the end of his life. As an honorable, successful, crusader warrior king, opponent to the tyranny of Richard II, and defender of his crown up to the moment of his death, the argument has been made here that he deserves a spot on the list of the greatest English monarchs, however contentious that assertion may be. Coming in at number 6, we have William III, aka William of Orange. Again, another contentious choice for this list. William was the grandson of King Charles I and had his own claims to the English crown, despite being Dutch. William's early life saw incredibly serious events play out in the Netherlands, as the powerful absolutist French monarch Louis XIV began exerting his will throughout Europe. Although William was at first prevented by political opponents from attaining the power that his father had had as stadtholder in the Netherlands, he was able to slowly gain back control as he aged, which allowed him to whip the underwhelming Dutch military forces into shape, at times doing so with one hand tied behind his back. When he was finally in a position to lead properly as stadtholder, William became the linchpin of the so-called Grand Alliance that stood up to the expansionist tendencies of Louis XIV and the French, which was crucial for the balance of power in Europe at that time. When the Catholic King James II of England, William's uncle and father-in-law, began to show signs that he could not be counted on as an ally against the French, William seized the opportunity to invade England after being invited by English nobles who were concerned with James II's Roman Catholic impositions. Although this event is remembered today as the Glorious Revolution and is often associated with the religious machinations of James II, William was more focused on securing England as an ally against the French than he was in defeating Roman Catholicism, despite the fact that he was a devout Protestant Calvinist. William successfully asserted his control in England after successfully invading in 1688, which allowed him and his wife Mary II to become joint sovereigns after her father James II fled into exile in France. Although William ruled solely in England after Mary's death in 1694, he had always held the real power between the two of them, as Mary had not been trained in stately affairs and submitted to her husband's discretion. With William on the throne, the nature of the monarchy as a whole began to shift in England, as William granted concessions to Parliament and began to move the monarchy towards the constitutional one that we recognize today in England. This shift, whether considered good or bad, has allowed this institution to exist in the modern day, for without it, the English monarchy may well have suffered the same fate that other less constitutional monarchies faced centuries later. With his influence in shifting English politics, his successful defense of England and the Netherlands against the extremely powerful French, and his crucial military victories when it mattered most, William, although imperfect and often overlooked, certainly deserves more attention as king, and from a brief history perspective, a spot on the list of the greatest English kings as well. In at number 5, we have Henry II. Henry, being the first Plantagenet king of England, could very well have never been king of England at all. His uncle, a man named William Adelin, should have inherited the English throne, but tragically died in a sailing accident known as the White Ship Disaster in 1120. Henry's mother, a former German empress named Matilda, was therefore designated as heir by her father, the at the time King of England Henry I. A conflict known today as the Anarchy erupted after Matilda's cousin, a man named Stephen of Blois, usurped the throne, with Henry's early life being dominated by this conflict. Henry, as he aged, eventually took the reins from his mother, fighting the back half of the Anarchy conflict and being successful in becoming Stephen's heir through negotiation. After succeeding to the throne, Henry was keen on righting the wrongs that had come about in England due to Stephen's poor rule, and in this Henry had great success. Already controlling parts of modern-day France, including Normandy and Anjou, Henry looked to further his territorial influence on the continent by marrying his French overlord, King Louis VII's ex-wife, Eleanor d'Aquitaine, or in English, Eleanor of Aquitaine. This risky move ultimately paid off, as with this marriage, Henry acquired the large territory of Aquitaine on the continent, increasing his land holdings and influence substantially. Although Henry's reign has been overshadowed in part by the murder of his former friend and saint, Thomas Becket, along with the tumultuous relationship that he had with his sons, Henry, Richard, Geoffrey, and John, Henry's reign was all in all a resounding success. He was extremely militarily gifted, he stabilized England after the long Anarchy conflict, and he was a king of England that would control one of the largest areas of influence in all of medieval Europe. At number 4, we have Henry I. Henry, the son of William the Conqueror and grandfather to the aforementioned Henry II, was initially intended to be a clergyman, being the youngest son of 4 boys. Although this soon changed with the death of one of his brothers, Henry was nevertheless taught to read, and this would be a factor that would set him up for success in the future. Henry battled with his famous brothers Robert Curthose and William Rufus early in his life and was successful in strategically positioning himself in William Rufus's England so that he could seize the throne should the opportunity arise. Indeed, with William Rufus's death in 1100, which could have possibly been orchestrated by Henry himself, this opportunity did in fact arise, and Henry rose to the task. Once Henry took control of England, he defended it admirably against his eldest brother Robert Curthose, who returned from crusade and attempted to push his own claims to the crown. Henry was well known for being an excellent ruler, and brought forth an era of proper administration, with the exchequer being established during his time as king, a governmental office still in operation to this day. Henry aggressively secured his French possessions on the continent by fighting and defeating the French, led at the time by King Louis VI, and was famous for raising so-called new men within his realm, so as to surround himself with loyal people that he could trust. Henry as a whole was a well-respected king, with his wise and calculating mind allowing him to consolidate power and rule appropriately from medieval standards. Coming in at number 3, we have Edward I, also known as Longshanks or the Hammer of the Scots. Edward, the son of the weak King Henry III, was forced to deal in his youth with the repercussions that came about during his father's poor rule, specifically the Second Barons' War, which saw many English barons push back against Edward's father's foreign favorites. Edward was instrumental in defeating his father Henry III's opponent, Simon de Montfort, at the Battle of Evesham in 1265, rescuing the captured king and killing de Montfort in the process. When Edward came to the throne in 1272, after his crusade in the Holy Land, he showed himself to be an able administrator and powerful military commander, attempting to reform the justice system and conquering the Welsh in 1283, while also defeating and subjugating the Scots for a time. His strategic victories in neighboring realms prompted Edward to engage in another practice that he's so famous for today, castle building. Edward was a strategic and incredible builder, and is arguably the greatest builder king that England has ever seen. He constructed the so-called Iron Ring of castles in Wales, which he used as power bases to exert his will on the Welsh populace after their defeat. This Iron Ring represents one of the greatest medieval building projects that Britain had ever seen, with many of these castles still standing as majestic and imposing ruins to this day. In addition to his military and political capabilities, Edward was well known to have had a proper private life as well. He was known to have had a good relationship with his Queen Eleanor, something that was a rare occurrence in the medieval world where arranged political unions could often cause more chaos or detestation than kinship or love. Furthermore, Edward was one of the first English patriot kings who often spoke English in a time when French was the language spoken at court and in many aristocratic circles. Being a crusader patriot and builder king who was incredibly successful in his military campaigns, keen on implementing needed reforms and justice, Edward lands at the number 3 spot on our list today. And at number 2, we have Queen Elizabeth I. There is much that can be said for one of the longest reigning monarchs in England's history. Elizabeth had an incredibly interesting and chaotic early life, with her mother Anne Boleyn being executed by her father King Henry VIII when Elizabeth was still a toddler. After being deemed illegitimate, Elizabeth was removed from the line of succession by her father, only to be reinstated years later by her father prior to his death. Despite the fact that both her younger half-brother Edward VI and elder half-sister Mary I would both attempt to remove her from the succession in their own right, they would both ultimately be unsuccessful in this, with Elizabeth duly inheriting the crown in 1558. Once becoming queen, Elizabeth was almost immediately thrust into the incredibly contentious and dangerous realm of world politics, where religion was becoming a matter of serious international dispute, due to the Protestant Reformation having taken hold of parts of Europe in the preceding decades. Elizabeth, returning England in essence to the religious settlement that her father had established years prior, walked the Anglican theological middle ground line between Roman Catholicism and radical Protestantism or Puritanism. This forced her to keep both the Catholics and the Puritans in check at home, and she did this by not giving either group too much in the form of support, generally not caring to know people's religious preferences, given that they remained loyal to the crown. Elizabeth certainly executed many in England, but often found ways to execute people under the charges of treason rather than heresy if necessary, and this, in part, is why Elizabeth's executions have been viewed in a different light when compared to those of her sister Mary, who famously developed the nickname Bloody Mary after burning many of her religious opponents at the stake for heresy. Elizabeth faced danger almost everywhere she turned. At home, in addition to the difficult religious group she was forced to deal with, her marriage prospects brought forth a danger of international strife, whether she married a foreign or domestic husband. Unfortunately, not marrying meant that she could not produce an heir, which could plunge the country into civil conflict should she die childless. Nor could she simply designate an heir for fear that this heir could become a rallying point of opposition. Elizabeth's solution to these problems was to do nothing, keeping everyone guessing as to her marriage and the succession, which allowed her to remain in an uneasy yet powerful limbo. Domestic issues were not only a danger to Elizabeth, as she faced trouble from aggressive Catholic international powers who wished to exert their will on what they saw as a heretic queen who was pursuing a less aggressive form of Protestantism, but Protestantism nonetheless. This included a succession of French kings to the south, a succession of popes in Rome, Mary Queen of Scots in the north, and most famously Philip II of Spain, a staunch Catholic king and Elizabeth's former brother-in-law, who sent an armada to conquer Elizabeth's England in 1588. Elizabeth bravely and capably led her people as the armada was handily defeated by the English navy and the weather, with the Spanish being sent home demoralized and empty-handed. There is no doubt that Elizabeth could certainly be ruthless, just as her father, sister, and brother could be, but her wise and shrewd mind allowed her to reign capably and strategically, and gave her the ability to steer England admirably during tumultuous times. In the end, Elizabeth would be one of England's longest reigning monarchs, who guided her country through a golden age of prosperity while defending her nation both politically and religiously. Her unmarried status and perceived virginity, whether true or not, allowed her to give the impression that she was focused on her country first and foremost, and this ultimately brought forth great love and admiration from her people. At number 1, the greatest king of England, we have Edward III. Edward began his kingship essentially in captivity, as his mother Isabella of France and her lover, Roger Mortimer, had seized power after deposing and executing Edward's father, King Edward II. Edward eventually grew tired of his mother and her lover's control over him and the country, and orchestrated a coup d'etat in 1330 where he forcibly seized control of the crown that was rightfully his. Edward is perhaps most well known for pushing his claims to the French throne, which were derived through his aforementioned mother Isabella, who was a daughter of the French king Philip IV. Although Edward was passed over due to him being English and due to France practicing Salic law, this did not prevent Edward from beginning to use the title King of France and attempting to exert his will in order to be recognized as such. Thus, the so-called 100 Years' War came about, which saw the French Valois kings defend themselves over the course of a century against the Plantagenet kings of England. Edward would define himself as one of the greatest, if not the greatest, warrior king, winning many well-known battles in said 100 Years' War, including most notably Crécy, Poitiers through his son the Black Prince, and through the siege of Calais. Very few kings in England's history were able to so capably and admirably win success against the French, and although the territorial gains he acquired through military victory and negotiation on the continent would not last indefinitely, it cannot be denied that Edward was an incredible and tremendously capable force to be reckoned with. He led heroically and commanded respect and devotion from the soldiers who followed him. Edward was a charismatic leader who had great success not only in battle, but also in the political and aristocratic realms, being well known for beginning the Order of the Garter, the highest chivalric order in the British honor system, still used to this day. This wraps up Brief History's list of the greatest English kings and queens. Please feel free to let me know what you agree with and what you disagree with in the comment section below. Cheers.